Wait, you're a cop?
Yeah, Leon Kennedy. You are?
Claire. Claire Redfield.
It's time. That is right, my ladies, gentlemen, and NBs. This is now officially a series. Yours truly had a lot of hot takes in the last episode, and this one won't be any different. But hey, that's what makes it fun. For me, at least. For real, though, today we're going to witness the battle between Resident Evil 2 from 2019 and Resident Evil 2! Sorry, it's all caps. Resident Evil 2, all caps, from 1998. You're chilling with me, Rain Noodles, your edgy Capcom friend. And if you're unfamiliar with my channel or this series, I highly advise you check out the first episode. It's a riot, and I more thoroughly explain the format in that video. To keep it brief, what I'll do is compare two games and up the stakes by awarding them points based on who wins in certain categories. And need I remind you, I have zero idea which game will actually win until I finish editing this video. The first game to reach my IQ is the better game, and my IQ is canonically 10, by the way. That's official Rain and Noodles lore. Speaking of my low IQ, there's an important statement that I need to make. I was rewatching the first part, finding things to improve for the sequel, and I found a few mistakes I made in that video. I tried to work these corrections into the intro for this video, but it ruins the flow. So if you want to see those, there will be chapters for this video. You can skip ahead if you want. They weren't a big deal, it's not like I fucking nuked Djibouti or some shit. But in the interest of not wanting to spread misinformation on the internet, I felt I should address some of the issues the RE1 video had. Only if you want it. I don't blame you for wanting to get into the video you fucking clicked on. And one last thing, if you end up liking this video, please consider helping out Jill Valentine on the screen there. If you do, she'll show you more of this Rain and Noodles guy. I hear he makes Capcom videos. No more bullshit, let's get started. Now we're going to be going off the same categories as the first video, with some slight changes. Speaking of that, in the first episode we started by talking about controls, and I explained that the earlier Resident Evil games had tank controls. For the uninitiated, that means you use left and right to steer and up to go forward. Well, this also applies to OG Resident Evil 2, which means that RE2 has the same accessibility problems as RE1. It ultimately depends on who you are, whether you like tank controls or not. On screen right now is actually a gif of me explaining why I love them. Now, while I personally love them, they don't have jack shit on RE2 Remake's controls. Maybe I'm batshit insane. I have zero clue if anyone else has ever felt this way, but sometimes I feel like the movement in Resident Evil 2 Remake feels like it has weight to it. It somehow feels like you're actually walking, even though you're just holding a controller. Capcom somehow found a way to recreate the tiniest bit of that awkward, labored movement of the tank controls without making it straight up frustrating. They made the act of walking feel immersive. And that's the level of polish we're dealing with here. Capcom has a movement system that's more detailed and unique than what the rest of the industry has. And that's just pushing the left stick around. The 3D camera is hands down way better. You can argue in favor of fixed camera angles all you want, and I'll even agree with what you have to say, but truth be told, this is just way better. It's far more intuitive to do this. It will always be much more intuitive for the character to adapt to where the player is facing than the player to adapt to where the character is facing, even if it works fine in some games like Devil May Cry. All of these improvements stem from the general theme of this entire video. RE1 Remake was a more faithful remake. It's supposed to very, very closely resemble the original game and simply improve on it. I actually got a comment on part 1 about why I even made that video. That's how similar the games were. And while I believe there are enough differences to warrant that kind of comparison, the contrast between that and Resident Evil 2's remake is what will make this video much more interesting. As opposed to a faithful remake, RE2R is a complete reimagining of Resident Evil 2! God, I did it again. So it leaves itself open to liberties and newer design philosophy. Not only that, but it's a much more advanced remake than RE1 Remake was. this. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. Resident Evil 2 Remake is fully 3D rendered, which means the camera is freely controllable. This makes the game way more comfortable to play on top of the fully revamped controls. All this combined means that the games that have tank controls do truly feel like dinosaurs in comparison. I'll use the MGS4 gif again, goddammit. I think I've made my arguments clear enough. Hopefully you can agree with me that once again, the remake simply has much better controls than the original game. What a shocker, right? The score is now 1 point for RE2 Remake, which leaves us at 0 to 1. And if you're a real sucker for tank controls, you could probably just pretend that the remake has them. Stars. Is it bad that I suddenly had an idea for a new live stream? Now we're going to be discussing the charming aspects of each game. I'm sorry, but the original game wins here, just like last episode. Our score is 1 to 1. And here's why. What is the number one thing you think of when you think of Resident Evil 2? Even if you've literally never played it, I'm willing to bet you think of Leon and Claire exploring the police station at the same time. Well, what if I told you that Remake does not have that? Remake has everything else you remember about RE2 except for everything that made having two different characters at the same place at the same time actually meaningful. Resident Evil 2 Remake simply cuts many of the really charming moments from the original game, which by the way, we'll be bringing up cut content quite a lot in this episode. In the original, Leon and Claire simply interacted face to face more, and you had a sense that they were both there, exploring the police station at the same time. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, Claire B's scenario would have Leon leave a note for her telling her that Chris is not there. Seems simple enough, right? Well, what if I told you that this used to be an entire cutscene in the original game? Leon made an effort to tell you in person, shifting the entire mood from dull to meaningful. It progresses Claire's story in a way that feels natural. This weird reality, however, is that just like in Remake, they actually don't see each other much in the original game either. This makes it so ironic that the remake feels so empty. The difference is in the original, it feels meaningful. There's character development being built here. The player's investment is actually being rewarded. In Remake, when the two interact, it's purely to serve the plot and convey information to the player. It's completely forgetting that these are characters we're supposed to be rooting for. It greatly harms the immersion of RE2's amazing scenario. At least let Leon make a booty call every now and then. Like, what the fuck, guys? That's my main reason, but we also have the fact that, like with RE1, the game takes itself way less seriously than the remake. The original PS1 trilogy felt perfectly comfortable with the fact that they were just goofy little video games. It doesn't push against the line of overstaying its welcome like the more gritty cinematic style. This of course means that the voice acting is also funny as hell, and the sound design is just so fucking 90s, man. I love this shit so much. Another positive of not taking itself seriously is the setting of RE2. Resident Evil 2 takes place in a fictional city in the Midwest called Raccoon City, but from what I understand, none of the RE2 staff ever took a trip to the United States. This is actually unlike later games like Devil May Cry or Resident Evil 4, where Capcom devs made it a point to accurately capture those environments depicted in those games. That means the entire setting of Resident Evil 2 is basically what a bunch of kooky little Japanese people think the United States looks like. And it's so fucking funny. I love this so much. It's this hyper stereotype of American culture. Well, I say American culture as if we didn't just steal it from everywhere else in the world. It's this incredibly stereotypical view of what America is. And as someone who lives in the Midwest of epic freedom land myself, I actually appreciate the new perspective this game brings to somewhere I've lived my entire life. Maybe I'm just being biased though. The remake took this and everything else, however, and made this more realistic and grounded, to the point that when redesigning Leon's police outfit, they actually consulted an OEM for military and police equipment. While there's a lot to gain from a more true-to-life approach, I feel like we lost a little bit of that original magical, silly ambition that the original game had. It ironically made Raccoon City feel more like a real place. It gave that setting a hilariously exaggerated reputation that you just know it by, like Texas or Ohio. You could sit down and imagine what life was like in Raccoon City before Umbrella messed everything up. But the remake takes this silly little town and turns it into something we already have to deal with every day. It takes all the excitement of being somewhere new and unfamiliar and throws it away. The original game handles all of this just so much better. hands down. Now I'm going to talk about story elements of both games, and I'm going to attempt to do it without revealing what each game has up its sleeves. Just like part 1, I want to make this video accessible to people who have yet to try RE2 or its remake. However, for you veteran players, I have a gut feeling that this section will be a riot, because I have to tackle what many agree is the biggest problem with Remake. Basically, this is where things get interesting. Now, I should mention that the original RE2 is actually my second most favorite Resident Evil game ever, right behind Resident Evil 7. I know, before you crucify me, let's just get back to Resident Evil 2, please. The biggest reason I love RE2 is the story. The best summary I can give of this game's story is that it's so ridiculous, it's impossible not to love. RE2 follows two characters, Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, sister of Chris Redfield. Leon is on his first day of the job at Raccoon City Police Department, and this is the shit show he walks into. It's insane. Once again, it's impossible not to love. Leon has to figure out why everyone is infected and do his duty to protect the few remaining people of Raccoon City by cutting some loose ends created by Umbrella. Claire is in Raccoon City to find her brother Chris, who is a member of STARS and presumably should be at the police station. Now, she doesn't exactly find Chris, but she finds someone way better. God, I fucking wish. She finds a little girl named Sherry. Very anticlimactic, I know. Both Leon and Claire endure a campaign where they learn more about themselves and life in general. One of the reasons I love RE2's story is this game went out of its way to be so much bigger than RE1. Hideki Kamiya of later Devil May Cry fame wanted to make the game feel much more larger than life. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. He hired a man named Noboru Sugimura as the writer to make the game feel much more ambitious. In Kamiya's words, he wanted to make the game feel like a Hollywood production, and Noboru was the perfect man for the job as he was already well accustomed to creating action-packed narratives for companies like Toei. He is known for producing work for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Kamen Rider, Metal Hero, and the list goes on. This means compared to RE1 and its story, Resident Evil 2 feels more like an action film, while also being the most raw survival experience out of the original trilogy. Resident Evil 2 was all about fun and constantly stealing your attention from Leon's polygonal cheeks. Compare this to the remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake throws all of that away and goes for a more cinematic, artistic approach. The development team for Remake described this game as more dramatic, and it's a very well chosen word. Remake makes significant changes to the story of the original game and makes even bigger changes on how it's presented. All of these changes Capcom personally felt were for the better, but I have a few disagreements with their approach. Actually, a great amount of RE fans do. So I want to pitch this segment this way. What does the remake do well, and what does the remake do worse? One thing the remake does really well is what Capcom said it would do well: drama. The remake much better communicates the impact of what Umbrella has done to the people who were unfortunately dragged into its downfall. This isn't a super heavy plot detail, it's just a hand-placed encounter, so I don't mind describing this in detail. In the original RE2, you meet a gun shop owner named Kendo. Kendo dies moments after you meet him. He's just there to be an action set piece. In the remake, you run into Kendo much later in the game, and it's established that he has a daughter that he's trying to protect. Kendo's daughter, as you can see, is infected. She's already been gotten to. Kendo is on high alert and nearly shoots Leon. It's very apparent that his daughter is slowly turning into a zombie, while Kendo is emotionally held hostage by the absolutely terrible position that Umbrella's arrogance has placed him in. He has to watch his daughter suffer like this, and the only solution being to put her out of her misery. But it's his daughter, man. It's not only an entire human being, it's the one he loves the most in the world. She is all that he has right now, the only thing that wasn't immediately taken by Umbrella's downfall. This puts him in a morally ambiguous situation. Does he murder someone he loves and live with that kind of guilt forever, or continue to let her suffer until she turns on him and possibly someone else? He breaks down in front of Leon and Ada and succumbs to his intense emotions and hatred for Umbrella, for literally ruining his and his daughter's lives. After this, he carries his daughter into a shack, and all you hear is an ambiguous gunshot. It's left up to the viewer what decision Kendo made. This moment perfectly reflects the biggest strength of RE2R. It makes you wake up a little and realize just how real this event is for the characters living in it. In the original game, it tends to feel like things are just there. Raccoon City feels like a real city, but you don't really know any of these people. The game makes you put in effort to find out who these people are by locating notes scattered across the map. These people are completely secondary to the game though. The main focus is Leon and Claire. In Remake, there are still some survivors, and each and every one has some bizarrely twisted way that Umbrella has changed their lives, usually for the worse. These events actually further motivate the main characters to push onward and really put an end to all of it. Not only that, but the line delivery from these characters is generally much more realistic. The characters talk a lot like how real people would talk in that situation. When I say this, I don't mean like Hollywood acting, where it's embellished to an extent to make it more appealing to view on screen. The lines are delivered almost like how the actors actually would talk non-ironically in that situation. There's not much music going. There's no elaborate mocap or choreography. It's dead silence and a few people talking. Here's Marvin as my perfect example of this.
Good. Hey. Hey, we should probably get you to a hospital.
Hold on. Forget about me. I can take care of myself.
No. Don't be ridiculous. You're gonna need some help.
Listen, Claire. Save yourself. So you can see your brother again.
I hope that helps you understand what I'm trying to explain. It's hard to decipher what I'm talking about here without hearing it for yourself, but that's very much what's going on. Basically, it's so many steps up from the uncanny halfway mark of the Resident Evil 1 remake. These characters feel closer to real people, with a few exceptions, which takes us into what the remake does worse. I alluded to this earlier, but Remake suffers a lot from cutting the chemistry between the existing characters and also cutting various portions of the game entirely. This is going to be a recurring theme in this comparison, trust me. Let's talk about chemistry. The remake likes to introduce opportunities for characters to develop connections with each other, but then they either make these connections more shallow or worse, they seem like they forgot the opportunity entirely. I'm not just talking about Leon and Ada, which honestly I could go on an entire rant about just that. To put it short, the conversations between Leon and Ada go from the two sharing a symbiotic relationship that eventually blossoms into love, to Leon getting bitched at, babysat, and girl bossed in every scene possible, yet the game pretends they develop a deeper relationship. If you played both iterations of RE2, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Same goes for Leon and Claire. In the original game, they establish themselves as friends and go out of their way to help each other achieve the other's goals. But in Remake, they're just two people who passively happen to be there completely independent from one another. Seemingly the only characters that were further fleshed out was Kendo and Marvin, and fleshing these guys out was not hard. By not having Marvin die the second you meet him, they were able to create a personality for him. We actually get to see a side of Marvin that just wasn't there to begin with, but that's exactly the problem. We see a side of Marvin, singular, only one. It's implied Marvin has worked there for a while. He's familiar with the layout of the police station, and it's implied he was bitten by a coworker that he knew. He never describes to Leon or Claire who it was who bit him and what relationship they had. He never goes into his history at the station. He never goes into how he earned his rank of lieutenant. He doesn't offer any pointers outside of "don't get bit." There's story elements there that conveys the theme of people losing their humanity once they become a zombie, but this theme is only conveyed to the player, which is a huge missed opportunity. He's just once again there exclusively to babysit Leon and Claire, just like Ada. Part of this is because Leon and Claire never ask.
Hey champ, that's really interesting. Next time, keep it to yourself.
The developers needed him to play backseat police officer so hard that they seemingly forgot to establish a deeper relationship between Marvin and the protagonist. They forgot that he was a character, not a tutorial. He doesn't have this intense conflict like Kendo did. His path in the story is already obvious the second you first meet him. The game tells you right away not to get too invested in this character. So the player feels a little bit of dissonance when they see the character react to what happens to Marvin completely differently from how the player does. It feels like you accidentally skipped several cutscenes, except you didn't. The developers just forgot to make Marvin more than just your babysitter. They create so many opportunities for a relationship between characters to form, only to make it disappointing with most of them. Then they went out of their way to give these characters more screen time, but ironically, They watered down a major mechanic that would have allowed us to explore these characters further. I'm talking about the A and B scenarios. They're technically there, but it's nowhere near the same capacity, and the game suffers heavily for it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, in the original Resident Evil 2, both Leon and Claire actually had 2 campaigns each. There was an A scenario and a B scenario for each one, and depending on which one you picked, it changed the game drastically. We're talking the way the characters interact, the puzzles, the order of progression of the whole game, the enemies that spawns, the weapons you find. It's basically a fully remixed version of the first playthrough. In Remake, the only thing that is altered is the starting point of the game and the puzzles. The reason this is significant to the story is that in doing this, Capcom weirdly mixed all of the scenarios together, and they accidentally did it in a way that logically wouldn't even make any sense. In the original game, the story from the A and B scenarios would differ so drastically, Capcom declared certain scenarios entirely non-canon in the Resident Evil universe. If you're curious, Claire A and Leon B is what is considered canon. But because these scenarios were basically mixed together in Remake, regardless of whether you play A or B, it causes a lot of weird plot holes and the outright removal of canon events. Essentially a gigantic contradictory retcon on Capcom's part, where the entire story is ambiguous and isn't even theoretically possible. I won't go into specifics, but a major enemy you face in the game literally dies for one character, but returns later like nothing happens for the other. It makes that little sense, and it's easily one of the biggest problems I have with Remake entirely. Overall, Remake is just missing a lot, and not in story but in gameplay too, and we'll have to touch on gameplay in a bit. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but I still cannot get over the fact that Leon simps for Ada in this game. Unless Leon just happens to have a thing for Asian bitches, I have no clue why he needs to go so hard for Ada.
I want to be ninja. I want to be ninja. I want to chop, 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 chow down. Take chow down to Chinatown.
I can't thoroughly explain why without spoiling part of the game, but I will say you're going to get to Leon's finale and you will be kind of confused. And I just want to say that's normal. Unfortunately. Like, damn, homie, why do you gotta like this bitch so much? You don't even know her. What about Claire? You have living, breathing, boulder punching coochie right there. Do your buddy Chris a solid, man. Carry on the bloodline. You think Chris Redfield is gonna settle for surrogacy? No. Do your part, Leon. Do it for your fans. Do it for your country. Continue the bloodline. This is so fucking stupid. You know what? Fuck this entire section. Just for daring to make Leon a simp, the original game gets a point. The score is 2-1. Fuck all this dramatic shit. Real talk. The map is actually a much smaller topic than last episode, which is ironic because the map is actually completely different between the two games. There's its share of similarities. The remake's maps still invoke the familiar feeling of Resident Evil 2 set pieces. The areas still feel vaguely how you would imagine they would, with some exceptions like the nest. However, each major area is streamlined and much more open-ended in Remake. There's many more paths to get to where you need to go, and that's because of a dynamic element we'll get into later. Hint, hint, it wears a fedora. Remake's maps are designed for the presence of its overhauled enemies, who heavily integrate themselves into the gameplay. And for this reason solely, I actually prefer the Remake map design. Remake's maps feel fully dynamic despite being static. Again, this statement is shrouded in irony when you consider that RE2 was basically a roguelite. The original Resident Evil 2 had a randomization mechanic. Enemies were not always found in the same exact place each playthrough. I've seen discourse online claiming that Remake lacks the random enemy placement, but I actually feel Remake does this better than the original game. Just hear me out. Zombies can move between rooms at will, and so can our special biohazard buddy. You can walk into a room and all of a sudden find zombies in there that weren't there before. And the developers don't just move them there, they naturally roam around however they want. The game doesn't even let certain enemies despawn, even when it would technically be the most practical. Mr. X stays fully rendered with all of his scripting running at all times, even if you're nowhere near him. The enemies may start in the same place, but unlike the original game, they dynamically move throughout the entire game. It's not forced upon upon them. And I feel this is an evolution of that original randomization philosophy. It feels like the next logical step to me. It feels like it's there not only in spirit, but better than ever. And it works with the rest of the game's systems, both static and dynamic, in a way that I have never seen in a Resident Evil game. You have objectives scattered throughout the map, and those objectives are always where you expect them. But being unable to expect whether you'll be harassed or followed while you complete those objectives, that's what gets my blood pumping. And that's the genius of Remake's map design. It works in tandem with its enemy design and its game design. I once had Mr. X circling around the library with me while I was using the crank to move the library shelves. I had to repeatedly cycle between dodging zombies, moving the shelf, running from Mr. X as his fist just barely grazes me, rinse and repeat. And it was the most intense experience I've ever had in a modern Resident Evil game.
Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. forgot what made Captain America the Winter Soldier so good. What? Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. never
Move.
figured out what story to tell.
No! Sorry, I was moving the library shelf and Mr. X fucking patted my asshole.
No, that's okay.
He patted my
Marvel
fat
TV
Redfield
shows
ass.
overshadowed- Other Marvel TV shows overshadowed Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Okay. That's purely based on
Oh my fucking god.
Agents
What?
of S.H.I.E.L.D. wasted some of its best villains.
That just doesn't happen often in the original, so I had to give my point to Remake. That leaves us at 2-2. Resident Evil 2 has contributed quite a lot to my penis music I have on deck for my YouTube videos, so it has a massive head start here. I wish I could say the same about Remake, but it winds up taking a more bizarre direction than even Resident Evil 1 Remake. There's hardly any music at all. The library theme? Nope. The main hall? I mean, it only plays the first time you enter, never again. The save room music? It's barely there. In the main game, there's almost no music playing at all, minus boss fights and the save rooms. It's only the bonus modes where Capcom bothered to have constant music for the game. However, don't get me twisted. I think this was the best decision they could have made. In the last episode, this category used to be called music, but I changed it to the word sound because the nuance of Resident Evil 2 Remake required it. It would be just a little unfair of me to slam RE2R just for the lack of music and not talk about the several places in audio where they just fucking slay it, man. The Resident Evil 2 Remake introduces a really cool feature to the RE engine called binaural audio. Or binaural? I don't... Come on, guys, give me a break. You may have seen these in some ASMR videos probably, but there's these special ear-shaped microphones designed to mimic the sound properties created by the shape of human ears. From what I understand, this is what Capcom used to record all of the custom sound effects used for the game. Then there's a dedicated 3D sound system that works in tandem with it, adding a lot of dynamic range to where the sounds, well, sound like they're coming from, to the point that you can hear something right fucking behind you. The first time I played Resident Evil 2 Remake with headphones, I nearly had a heart attack because it was just so jarring just how real the enemies in the game sounded. I especially felt my heart pumping when I heard Mr. X stomping around, and I could pinpoint his exact location as he was headed towards me. Capcom decided that in this game, audio should serve gameplay and not atmosphere. Enemies in the game have their own specially made stings and audio cues. Here's what it sounds like when you're around zombies. Here's what it sounds like when you're around dogs. And here's what it sounds like when Mr. X is coming for your fucking ass. It helps the player identify what enemies are present when they're off screen. And with the sound effects working in tandem with their advanced sound systems, the player can even hear exactly where the enemies are, which is probably why there's so little music in Remake. They must have figured these cues designed to help the player would compete too much with whatever music is playing in the background. So I can completely understand why the music just isn't there. That being said, the absence of the original music wouldn't be so noticeable if said music wasn't so amazing. And this is what made this section so hard for me personally. Do I give the original a point for having an amazing score and decent sound design? Or do I give the remake a point for actually pushing both technological and sound design boundaries in the industry? It's ultimately subjective, but I've thought a long time about this and decided I wanted to give this point to Remake. You could make a really great case that Resident Evil 2 Remake is one of the reasons the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles have much more advanced audio capabilities. You could make a really good case that Remake's audio design has already influenced many a horror game of the modern era. You could make a really good case that this game is probably why we have so many newer AAA games either coming out with or later adding in dedicated 3D audio functionality. Hell, they even put the 3D audio in fucking Monster Hunter. Capcom is so proud of this technology that they're just throwing it in every game now. So that means that the score is now 2-3, with Remake in the lead so far. And now we get into the good stuff. The enemies is one of many elements that the Resident Evil series is best known for. I mean, the Japanese name of the series is Biohazard, and that's exactly what you fight in these games, so how does the remake handle RE2's enemies, which are easily some of the most famous in the entire series? It should be mentioned that Resident Evil 2 was the first game where actually stunning the zombies instead of killing them became a big deal. You could shoot zombies in the legs to disable their ability to walk. You could decapitate them with bullets to the head, or you could topple them over and just run past them as they flop on the ground. This gave the original RE2 a lot of depth to its combat, because now there's an impactful choice to be made with how many bullets you want to use. You could clear an enemy entirely but sacrifice an absurd amount of ammo, or simply pass by with a few bullets, but you have to do it once again when you come back. The game plays into this by creating dozens of different scenarios that absolutely require the player to think on their feet and make the best decision as fast as possible. All of these nuanced shooting mechanics are seamlessly carried over into Remake. If anything, they're even more effective thanks to the game carrying over Resident Evil 7's focus mechanic. If you're not familiar, RE7 had a mechanic where your shots become more accurate and had more stun if you stayed still for a few seconds before firing. This is indicated by the crosshair in both games becoming a solid white dot, which means that Remake expands upon the zombie stunning system further, to the point where many zombies can be disabled briefly with only one bullet depending on your difficulty level. With an exception of a few enemies that were sadly cut, almost the whole gang is here, and they're drastically improved compared to the original. Actually, there's one that I could gush about forever, but I'll try to keep it brief. His name is Mr. X. Where's Mr. A and Mr. P and Mr. C? Jokes aside, everyone, the changes made to Mr. X alone is easily one of the biggest glow-ups I've seen in a video game. This iteration of Mr. X happens to borrow a lot from his big Biohazard cousin, Nemesis, down to the suspenseful music that plays when he's chasing tail, followed by the iconic stomping that can be heard world round, down to the brick shitting entrance he makes, picking up and moving an entire blockade as his debut, putting himself right in front of you, down to the way that he suddenly appears right next to you exactly when you don't want to see him. This is the next big evolution of what was started by Nemesis, and Mr. X is the poster child for Resident Evil's more recent enemy archetype known as the Stalker. Even though the Stalker takes on many forms, from Nemesis to Lisa Trevor, Jack Baker, Lady D, Mr. X seems to be the one that first comes to mind. And I think this is because Capcom made this version of him the scariest out of all of them. Nemesis is fast and he's cunning, but you can't say he's 100% scary. He's got a personality to his behaviors that allow you to anticipate him. The fact that he's just running around moaning "stars" doesn't really help him either. He kind of comes off as a bonehead. Jack Baker is scary, but only because of what he's capable of and who he used to be. Lisa Trevor is scary due to her appearance and her ties to the game's world building. Lady D is just a fat, succulent hourglass figure. Don't act like she's any more than that. Remake's Mr. X is so blank, it's what makes him terrifying. Mr. X is the scariest to me because he's a monster on a mission. He's not some sadist to take pleasure in tormenting you. He's there for one purpose, and that is to kill. All of the other stalkers either run up and troll you or only attack you because you get in their way. Mr. X is an emotionless killing machine. It's his job to wipe you out as quickly and efficiently as possible. He is so unstoppable that you can't even kill him. Bullets don't even work. A magnum round will only give him a headache at best. Mr. X doesn't run to you at all. He doesn't need to. He's so focused on you that he walks in a straight line and simply moves whatever gets in his way. He'll even burst right through a wall if he happens to hear you on the other side. I can hear you saying, that's always been Mr. X's shtick though, hasn't it? Yes, you're correct. But combine this tweaked idea of Mr. X with the fact that he fully wanders the entire police station. Now you can see what I mean. As I mentioned earlier, enemies in Resident Evil 2 Remake roam around the map entirely on their own. This new mechanic goes the hardest with Mr. X. If you didn't know, the Mr. X from the original Resident Evil 2 was simply a hand-placed encounter every time you fought him. He was always limited in what rooms he could be in, and he was honestly not too difficult to run away from. The only secret sauce he had was he showed up when you weren't expecting him. But in Remake, he follows you everywhere, and he will never stop fully chasing, no matter how much you shoot. He is a constant threat throughout the entire game. Let's not even get into the fact that if you play on the hardcore difficulty, it can take him only one well-placed swing to kill you right where you stand. When I was playing Resident Evil 2 Remake when it was new, Mr. X genuinely gave me a panic attack. My heart rate would literally rise just seeing him there. I actually felt like my life was in an inescapable danger every time he showed up. I legit needed to turn the game off, I was so scared. Maybe I'm just a pussy, but I'm being 100% honest when I say that there were moments where I found myself so immersed in this game that I actually thought I was going to die. He so perfectly captures what makes this enemy design so great in Remake. The rest of the enemies in Remake are essentially diet versions of what makes Mr. X work. The zombies and lickers can catch you off guard, but they do it in a much more subtle and forgiving way. The enemies working in this way is actually why I talked so much about them while I was talking about the map design earlier. Because if you think about it, Resident Evil 2 Remake isn't you fighting the enemies, it's you fighting the map. The two are so closely integrated that they're virtually the same thing. And if there was one thing negative I had to say about Remake's approach to enemy design, it has to be the bosses. It is so disappointing when you have to do a boss fight in this game, because the entire game takes place in this open-ended labyrinth that lends you so many ways to get out of a sticky situation. When you fight a dedicated boss, you're locked up. You start feeling claustrophobic. This isn't helped by the fact that some of the arenas you fight these bosses in tend to be narrow and, worse, tend to not offer enough supplies to be forgiving. It's not like the bosses are hard, mind you, but every boss fight feels like a major part of the game is taken away from you temporarily. Not everything is perfect, but I have to say Remake has earned itself yet another point, leaving us at 2 to 4. Remake has been having one hell of a win streak, which I honestly wasn't expecting whatsoever. It just consistently improves upon so many things that the original game is struggling to cover any more ground. But let's not forget, we eventually have to talk about cut content, and it's not going to be pretty for Remake once we do. So let's talk visuals. If you guys saw the last episode, you know that I love me some PS1 games. I basically talked about them constantly in that video, which looking back may have been a little distracting and tangential, but fuck it, it's my video, go play MGS1. But this time it's different. We have a PS1 game versus not a GameCube game, but a full-scale, modern, huge-budget AAA game. A game that apparently took 800 employees to create, many of them being masterful artists of various mediums. When I first saw Resident Evil 2 Remake, my socks were blown off. I have yet to see many better-looking games since this one came out, and two of those ones where I have were also Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 7 was the game that sold me on the RE engine being a lightweight, optimized, but beautiful game engine. Resident Evil 2 Remake was the game that sold me on the idea that the RE engine was an entire content platform that not only looked phenomenal, but was easily modifiable and had room to integrate new features down the line. And we'll get into that in a bit. Let's talk about how the two versions look first. The original Resident Evil 2, even though it was on the same console as its predecessor, definitely looked better than Resident Evil 1. There was more spunk in the animations, things just felt more alive. The pre-rendered backgrounds were given just a little more time in the oven. Cutscenes were more complex and polished, they were less jarring. There's hair physics and head tracking systems. Resident Evil 2, without a doubt, is a massive upgrade over Resident Evil 1, and I heavily appreciate the development that went into polishing the features of that game. But as you can probably predict, it does not compete with its remake. which is entirely expected. In the last episode, I said I liked the way that the original RE1 looked over its 2002 remake. However, I would be fucking nuts if I said the same thing in this video. RE2 Remake looks so good, it beats whatever novelty I hold for the original. RE2 was a technologically impressive sequel, but Remake takes that to a completely new level. They somehow managed to find Instagram models that happen to look exactly like you imagine Leon and Claire would look. The incredible attention to detail with accurate, realistic lighting, the rain, the water effects. Leon and Claire look like they're actually doused in water when they go outside. And listen to this, the characters will literally moan or grunt when they see something of interest. Sometimes you can literally hear them breathing, and unique custom animations for every gun in the game. Hundreds of different ways the enemies can just destroy you. Everything, man, everything is so insane in this game. Those 800 employees must have been microdosing on mushrooms or some shit, because the level of detail in this game is inhuman, even for a team that large. They went above and beyond for everything. This section used to be just graphics, but I had to add an entire detail part to it single-handedly because of Resident Evil 2 Remake. I mean, look at this shit. What's there for me to critique, man? If I had to be picky, like really picky, like you'll immediately command me to touch grass picky. First of all, I live in Fallout New Vegas. There is no grass. Second of all, textures look kind of chunky, especially at higher resolutions, but only if you sit there and stare at it. In motion, it's just fine. And it's really only the environment textures, the stuff you're going to be looking at most, like your player character, feel next gen, which is insane because this is a PS4 game, need I remind you. The RE engine has a lot of quirks with consuming a lot of VRAM, so I'm not surprised that the textures kind of had to take a hit just to literally fit it in the frame buffer. But Capcom did a stellar job at making sure it wasn't going to make that much of a difference visually, which is truly insane. They did such a good job on it that genuinely I've never bumped into another person who said anything about the textures. It's possible that only I and maybe like a few other people even noticed it, let alone pointed out. That's fucking insane. And if they really bother you that much, there's an upscaled texture pack that I'm using in this video, which brings us into modding. The community has already gone mental, bringing the level of detail even further up there for this game. This Reshade preset that I'm using right now is easily one of my most favorite Reshade presets I've ever used. I'll try to find it and link it in the description if you're interested. Even Capcom was developing ways to take this game's visuals to the next level. They ported Village's ray tracing support backwards into the slightly older build of the RE engine that Resident Evil 2 Remake was using. It's safe to say I feel that Remake greatly excels in this area, and it's deserving of a point in my book. The score is 2-5 with Remake in the lead once again. Graphics are ultimately subjective, of course, but you want to know it's not subjective. We don't see any Claire bikini for the original RE2, now do we? Check mate, atheists! The future is now, old man! This section used to be called Atmosphere, however, I found it a little redundant when I went back to my last video. I felt it would be much more useful to actually explain the gameplay differences between these two games. I'm gonna spoil it here, I'm actually gonna give double points this round, which takes us to 3-6. I passionately enjoy both of these games on the regular. I have the slightest boner for the original RE2, but Remake straight up has gameplay mechanics that I wish were in the original. And Remake lacks gameplay features that were present in the original. Let's go over what Remake does interesting. In the older Resident Evil games, you were given a knife. This is a weapon with infinite ammo that came at the cost of needing to perfectly space yourself between your enemies to avoid taking damage. Well, in Remake, this knife is not infinite. Knives have a durability mechanic to them now. So as opposed to something you fall back on, knives are now a weapon that complement your guns. In the older Resident Evil games, there's not much reason to have the knife on you if you're smart with your ammo. It was basically just a wasted inventory slot. But in Remake, the knife now helps you drastically save on ammo and adds another way to get past zombies as well. This is because the knife also doubles as a dagger from the Resident Evil 1 remake. When a zombie clutches onto you, you can fully avoid damage by quickly tapping the shoulder button and stabbing it with a knife. If you kill the zombie, you can get that knife back too. But sometimes I'll use it as just a means to get past a lone zombie without using any of my bullets, and I'll just abandon my knife if it's low on durability anyways. You can also use the knife offensively by knocking a zombie down with your gun and simply slicing at the zombie until it stops moving, taking care of the threat while using minimal ammo. I love that Capcom took an item that has limited use and found ways to turn it into genuinely one of the most useful items in the entire game. The knife gets even further expanded upon in Resident Evil 4 Remake as well, almost like Capcom was naturally building up to the idea of Leon becoming a master of wielding blades. It actually makes me curious of what they'll think of for the inevitable Resident Evil 6 Remake. However, not all gameplay is great with Resident Evil 2 Remake. I mentioned this earlier, but RE2R effectively combines A and B scenarios into one, causing issues in story continuity. Well, what if I told you that this applied to gameplay as well? My biggest problem with Remake's gameplay is that it lacks the zapping system. For the uninitiated, there was a mechanic in Resident Evil 2 where the actions of one character you play had direct consequences for the other one. So if Leon took, say, a submachine gun, that means you would come back to the police station as Claire and it's gone. Claire can't also have it. On your first playthrough, this system makes the game much more intense as you realize you might have royally fucked yourself against Mr. X, who only shows up in the second campaign. And for repeat playthroughs, this added a whole layer of planning to your gameplay. You had to decide whether Leon or Claire needed the item more on a regular basis. This just didn't exist in Remake because, once again, Remake watered down the continuity entirely. This is what frustrated me the most about Resident Evil 2 Remake. Why would you remake Resident Evil 2 and then remove everything that was unique about Resident Evil 2? Why remake the game that has two characters there at the same time, then remove all the consequences of having two characters there at the same time? It just didn't make any sense to me. It makes even less sense when you consider that they downright improved literally everything else. The two games also share a few things in common. You walk much slower as you take more damage. You can strategically push zombies to give yourself breathing room, and you can juke them in order to pass right by them. And like I mentioned earlier, there are deeper shooting mechanics where you can disable the zombies across a myriad of methods. So now you can probably see why I wanted to give both a point. Both games excel in the same area, but in different ways, while at the same time having the same fundamental strengths that make them both appealing to someone looking for a survival horror game. And it truly is up to whatever mood I'm in which one I play out of the two. And this brings our score to 3-6. I was building up to this the entire video, and now we're finally talking about content. Straight up, Resident Evil 2 simply has more, which takes us to 4-6. The reason why is because Remake cut out entire areas of the game and subsequently everything those areas held. And this is an even bigger problem in Resident Evil 3 Remake as well, by the way. Let me remind you that there's no zapping in this game, which means repeat playthroughs end up being more similar. That content is gone. We're also missing entire story beats and scenarios. That content is gone. So on top of no zapping, no true A to B scenarios, and several canonical events being fully removed and replaced, there are sections of the entire original game that just straight up no longer exist. Now this problem isn't as bad as Resident Evil 3 Remake, believe me, but RE2R started this weird trend of Capcom just retconning parts of these games for literally no reason. In the original game, there were giant spiders in the sewer system that you had to traverse. In Nest, there used to be gigantic moths and other creepy crawlies that harassed you in an absolutely filthy part of the map. There's no train yard for whatever reason. There are entire boss fights not accounted for. The game doesn't even have crows. Like, fine, if you don't want to make the giant bugs, sure, but you're telling me crows were too unrealistic for your gritty survival horror game? Now, none of these things are major elements of Resident Evil 2, but that's just what's cut. What is accounted for? I don't know, guys. This game just feels a bit too short for a modern game, especially Claire's campaign. Claire's campaign feels nowhere near as long or as interesting as Leon's, which is funny, by the way, because Leon's campaign is literally just him getting bitched at constantly. Now, in reality, the two games are actually around the same length. You can beat Resident Evil 2 Remake in the same amount of time it takes to beat Resident Evil 2, but that's not entirely what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the missing what if scenario, Leon A and Claire B. If Capcom is going to converge all the scenarios together in this bizarre way, what's even the point of playing all of them? It feels like an entire major campaign is missing, and that's a huge problem with Remake's amount of content to go around. It's there, you can play them if you want, but is copying and pasting the same campaign and calling it a different one really more content? It's a humongous blow to the game. Thank the heavens that all the bonus modes are there and everything, but that doesn't ease my concern over the fact that there's an entire half of the main game which is retconned out of existence. And then that begs the question, shouldn't this game have more than what's on those 2 PS1 discs? This is a gigantic AAA game with a massive budget and team behind it, and they didn't take the time to develop the what if scenario, so where's the content that's supposed to fill that gap? It's bizarre. This game feels like it got plenty of development time and money. It feels like a fully finished game, but then how on earth do you explain the missing scenario? Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for it, but the end result is Remake simply doesn't have as much to do as the original game, at least in terms of the vanilla game. There's plenty you can do with modding, of course, and people are playing this game on the regular and making it work. It's not a game devoid of content, but remember that this game used to be $60. It doesn't get a pass just because it's $20 now. So I hope I've made my point clear as to why Remake just falls apart here. This puts us at 4 to 6. This section is piss easy. You can obtain Resident Evil 2 and its remake. That's it. That's all there is to it. Okay, if you want specifics though, Resident Evil 2 Remake can be purchased on major storefronts for whatever platform minus the Switch. You can find it on Steam, on Xbox, and on PlayStation, and it's literally as easy as typing Resident Evil 2. You can download it right now after this video if you really wanted to. Because this game is still pretty modern, but old enough to where many people have already played it, you can probably just buy a copy for cheap at a regular ass game store. Hell, you could borrow or even buy a copy off of one of your friends, or family share with them, I don't judge. Or just pirate it. I mean, is Capcom really hurting for $20 from a 4-year-old game? Once again, I won't judge. As a side note, since we're talking about piracy, this game used to have Denuvo in place when it launched, but Capcom actually took it out shortly afterwards. And this applies to every RE Engine game they've released as of late. They actually removed Denuvo from Village just a bit ago. If you're unfamiliar, Denuvo is a copy protection software that prevents people from pirating video games, but it tends to be very intrusive and cause problems for people who don't pirate, which is why everyone hates it. I want to give a quick round of applause to Capcom for not being one of those shit developers that put Denuvo in their game and leave it in there forever. They seem to actually understand that someone downloading their video game several years after launch isn't actually gonna hurt their bottom line. I mean, not that I'm condoning it, but I'm saying even Capcom is basically telling you they don't give a shit if you do. Just saying. Now let's talk about the original Resident Evil 2. I checked the PlayStation and Xbox storefronts, and sadly you can't really find the original games on there. But for my fellow computer havers out there, I'm willing to bet you know a guy who knows a certain website that has a certain vault where you can download certain old video games. Certain old video games of the free persuasion. Jokes aside, of course there are ways you can just download this old ass game, and odds are you have a device that can run it so long as you're a little bit crafty. If you want to know specifically which ports are worth seeking out, may I suggest the GameCube version? I completely neglected to mention the GameCube ports of these games in my last video. They boast a unique array of features like updated models, updated controls, etc, etc. They're essentially the same games but enhanced. However, if you want Resident Evil 2 physically, do not go after the GameCube version. I say this because if you want Resident Evil 2 for the GameCube, it will cost you much more than it's actually worth. I mean, just glancing at eBay, I think it should be fucking criminal to charge $500 to play a boomer PS1 game on an equally boomer GameCube. Don't buy from scalpers. Fuck these people. Just download the GameCube game ISO and throw it in Dolphin. There's also absolutely nothing wrong with playing the PS1 version. There's a phenomenal PlayStation 1 emulator I've been using for years called DuckStation, and it's actually how I recorded this gameplay footage of the original game. That's right, you can play RE2 Original with 4K resolution, improved texture filtering, and no wobble thanks to this magical little piece of software. I'm going out of my way to point this out because someone in my comments from the last video was convinced I wasn't playing the PS1 version of the game in my footage. It's that advanced. This emulator is capable of working voodoo magic with these games, man. I think I've talked enough about obtaining these games. TLDR, both iterations of RE2 are very accessible, and honestly, I think you should go out of your way to play both if you can, which is honestly the way all things should be. That leaves us with 5 to 7, with Remake in the lead. Now we're going to take a look at what the overall Resident Evil community thinks is the better game. I like this section a lot because it basically gives me an excuse to make a bucket of popcorn and open up Reddit. It seems that when I browse Reddit, the primary consensus is that it's an even split, but when I go on GameFAQs, the original game is better. This is probably one of very few times I've actually seen a GameFAQs thread not devolve into a shit show with a bunch of losers virtue signaling in front of other losers. On Twitter, don't you mean X? Fuck it! God, fuck it! Honest to Christian Weston Chandler, guys, I wouldn't bother including this section if it wasn't so fucking funny watching people go genuinely apeshit over a video game. I'm just giving both a point because it's either I side with the millennials on Reddit or I side with the horn dogs everywhere else, so I would rather do neither. I'll die a fence sitter if I have to. That puts us at 6 to 8. We're going to quickly talk about survival horror, the genre that Resident Evil itself popularized. You can have a horror game, something that makes your heart rate jump and keeps you hesitant to enter every room. You can have a survival game, a game that requires critical thinking and resource management. But what makes Resident Evil so great is that it's the king at both, which is why we have to decide which game does survival and which one does horror the best. Some of you at home who are capable of doing basic math can probably piece together who wins both of these categories. But I have to admit, for both of these categories, it was actually a really close call. Remake wins in terms of survival, and here's why. Resident Evil 2 Remake has a bigger emphasis on survival for several of the reasons that we actually talked about earlier. The fact that the enemies chase you and act unpredictably. The fact that knives are now a limited resource. The fact that they expanded on Resident Evil 2's existing survival mechanics. In my Resident Evil 1 comparison, I said that the original Resident Evil 2 was the most raw survival experience, but I've rescinded that opinion after revisiting both of these games. I actually think that title belongs to Remake. What helped me change my mind was actually a complaint I've seen wielded against the remake. The enemies are spongy. Bruh, die. Die. What the fuck? Are you fucking... Took me almost 2 clips to kill that fucking guy. Are you kidding me? I was headshotting him several fucking times, man. I was headshotting him several times. Jesus. Fucking hell. Are you... Still not dead. That was literally 2 clips. That is so fucking stupid, man. You need a lot of ammo in order to actually kill anything, way more than in the original. I've seen many people say this while I was doing my peer review and double checking my information, and I actually agree with it personally. Resident Evil 2 Remake isn't a game where you're rewarded for playing it like a survival game. You have to play it like a survival game, otherwise it can't be beat. Not on any difficulty above assisted, anyways. Resident Evil 2 Remake focuses so heavily on survival that it actually comes to its detriment sometimes. This actually explains some of the passing comments I've heard about this game being unfair. You actually cannot waste that much ammo or you're genuinely boned. And if your aim isn't the best, yeah, that can be a real problem. It actually felt like the polar opposite to the big problem I had with Resident Evil 3 Remake, where that game felt too much like a short action game because it had way too much ammo and mechanics to go around. In a way, RE2R has a much heavier emphasis on survival, but is that necessarily a good thing? Is there such a thing as too much survival in a survival horror? Before making this video, I didn't really think that was a problem that the Resident Evil series had at any point in time. But looking back at 2 Remake, I'm thinking this game might have actually alienated some people who like survival horror but don't love it. So even though RE2R gets the point here, the survival experience is really only better if that's what you're looking for. Otherwise, you might just have to play on assisted just to make the game more manageable. There's no shame in that. Lower difficulties exist so that people who aren't gods at video games can still enjoy them. But I can't help but wonder if more people played the game unassisted than maybe the developers intended. That's my soapbox, and that puts our score at 6-9. We've arrived here at last in our final section. Resident Evil 2 is a pretty scary game. It employs a variety of tactics to get you to jump as many times as possible. You have to walk slowly whilst there are other enemies around you to avoid lickers, a scenario where you're basically begging for something to go wrong. You have Mr. X charging through the walls and pummeling you just when you forget about him. You have the all too familiar situation of having no ink ribbons and having to move through hordes of enemies. Resident Evil 2 is scary in a video gamey way. The stakes are really high and the game is really hard. While the zombies, lickers, and mutants may stop being scary over time, what doesn't is the classic Resident Evil scenario of not being near a save room. Resident Evil 2 Remake is scary in some of these ways, but if you're skilled at the game, it's a walk in the park. Mr. X swinging his arms at you stops being terrifying when you realize how easy it is to make him miss. But you want to know what still scares me about Remake? The batshit insane level of gore in this game. It's absolutely fucking disgusting. And I mean that in a good way, by the way. It's not scary when you die in Remake, it's scary the ways you can die. One of the scenes in Remake that remained permanently ingrained in my brain for years is the scene where Leon and Claire will pull out the police officer from under the door, and he gets a sudden pain in his lower half of his body and starts screaming. His wailing was already enough for me to feel very uncomfortable. He was in real pain for sure. But what got me was how much worse the situation got just a second later. After dragging the officer out, it's revealed that he's missing his entire bottom half. I'm blurring it because, you know, it's YouTube, but the game shows explicit, uncensored, realistic severed body parts, and people die in horrific ways. This unlocked a different kind of terror for me when playing the remake, a terror knowing someone sat down and willingly animated that. Now you're scared of what you're gonna see in the next cutscene. You're scared of what the developers are cooking up to throw in your face later. You're scared in a way that you have a pit in your stomach from what you just witnessed, and now you're just worried that feeling is going to come back after you complete your next objective. And ladies, gentlemen, and envies, the fear is perfectly justified because the game gets gradually more and more and more fucked as you sit there and watch. You want to know the real kicker? All of this gameplay footage where I've been shooting at zombies, all these cutscenes I've shown, everything I put on screen in this whole video, it was a mod that reduces the blood, gore, and violence. Yes, this is what it looks like with reduced violence. It is several folds more gory than what I've been showing you this whole time. Now, is it Doom or Mortal Kombat level? Not really, but for Resident Evil, this was insane. So insane they actually had to censor it in Japan. So if you happen to not really be down for gore, you can totally seek the Japanese version of the game, or you can use a mod on the PC copy like I did. And this is why I think Remake is scarier. It takes the gore to a new extreme that it's scary how far they were willing to go with it. And that brings us to our final score, 6-10. And you all know what that means.
Stop
Now, before I wrap up this video, I want to make something abundantly clear. I know how divisive this game is. While I was researching this video, I saw time and time and time again where people turned into fucking lunatics debating which of these two games are better. Unlike my RE1 video, there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of people who really do care this much about a video game. I don't want to say it's wrong to be emotionally invested in the topic of this video. That's what makes these comparison videos fun. You can have a favorite out of these two games. I know I do. But judging off of the arguments I see online, I wouldn't be surprised if I get comments accusing me of being a simp for the remake. And I also wouldn't be surprised if I simultaneously get comments telling me I was too hard on the remake. If that's you, I ask that you please calm down and hear me out for a second. Remake winning does not mean the original is boo-boo. Actually, I prefer the original game over the remake. Remake winning also does not mean that it's the end-all be-all game. Remake only won because it technically got more points. That's literally the only reason. Which is why I want to say that if you can, you need to play both of these games. Do not sleep on either one. And if you're upset that one of these games won or lost, I'm happy to inform you that you're missing the point of this video. I didn't make this series to tell you one game is genuinely better than the other, despite the title. I made this video to teach you about Resident Evil 2 without you getting bored. This series is for people like me who like analysis videos, but hate feeling like they're in school. Cause honest to goodness, guys, some of the videos I've seen on this platform, they might as well have been in fucking MLA format. So don't take this video too seriously. My entire YouTube channel is anything but serious, I promise you that. I only say all of this because I've seen some discourse online that made me think it was necessary to include here. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that I had a few things to address. I wanted to apologize for a few things. First of all, I am incredibly sorry this video took so fucking long. I literally teased it for half a year and it's only just now coming out. This was a very time-consuming video to make, primarily because I had so much to say about these phenomenal games. I just couldn't leave things the way they were. I just had more and more to say as I was working on it. This was a very deep analysis of both versions of Resident Evil 2, as you could probably tell from the length of this video. Fun fact, this video is actually as long as it takes to get to Nest in Resident Evil 3 Remake. I wasn't joking about that game being fucking short. It's a, man, that video is gonna be a fucking disaster, man. Resident Evil 2! Bet you thought I forgot about that bit. RE2 in specific is one of my most favorite RE games ever, and I hope it shows in this video. At first, I wasn't happy with the script, then I wasn't happy with editing, then I wasn't happy with the montage. I also wanted to overhaul and fix a lot of problems I noticed in the RE1 video. That video was way too fucking quiet. It was weird that I used footage of games that weren't Resident Evil 1. Some of the categories were genuinely pointless or too vague. And then there's one part of the video where I felt I took things just the tiniest bit too far. In that video, I commented that at times in the Resident Evil 1 remake, characters would, quote, look like a cardboard cutout. This is true, I still believe this wholeheartedly. What embarrassed me was I chose the worst possible scene to demonstrate this. The scene where Jill is watching her comrade get eaten by mutant dogs. I, for some reason, picked this one scene in the remake where it makes the most sense for her to be static. I made this mistake partially because I made an assumption. I didn't pay attention to the full context of the cutscene. I had seen this cutscene a million times and I assumed I would remember what happened in it. Clearly I didn't. This incident was also partially because I am mentally disabled. For those interested, I have alexithymia. I'm not going to sit here and explain what it is and throw a little pity party. I mean, you can Google it yourself and come to your own conclusion. You really do not need some idiot on YouTube to spoon feed your feelings to you. That little slip up made me come off as extremely insensitive, and I just want to apologize to anyone who was put off by that. I recognize it was very bizarre. Granted, literally only one person ever pointed it out, and truth be told, I noticed it myself before they did, but I'm glad that I could explain that after all this time. I went out of my way to make sure these mistakes never happened again in this video. I spent a lot of time with this episode completely overhauling my entire process for continuing this series, and that's because I plan to make tons more of these kinds of videos. Naturally, that meant I had to address and rework many of the issues I had with episode 1. The earlier I can fix all of these glaring issues, the better. I can genuinely say I am very proud of this video and how it turned out, and I'm excited to announce that I already started with the Resident Evil 3 part. And of course, I've had people ask about Resident Evil 4 too. It'll come eventually, I can promise you that. And we might even have a non-Resident Evil game take a spin at this format at some point. There is a lot going down on this channel, so I ask that if you genuinely liked this video, my friends, please show some extra support. Because like I said, this video took a lot of extra effort. Please share this video with your fellow Capcom fans, because YouTube actually doesn't know this is a Capcom channel, and I have proof. It's in this video here. If I can get Capcom fans to watch my Capcom videos, that'll help YouTube show my stuff to even more Capcom fans. And then we can all have a great time talking about these amazing games. Once again, only share this video if you actually liked it though. Speaking of liking my videos, here's a massive shout out for the people who do. Noel Rebiff, D://Jack, I Draw Edit, Y2K as in the RPG, guys, the postmodern RPG, Zeta Beta the Alpha, and then funnily enough, Alpha 19602, EJ, Jose, oh fucking hell, Jose Villarreal 19, and then for some reason some people weren't showing up. I saw some in like my bell icon. Aiden M, Landon L. I've been having people subscribe in like the last couple of days, so sorry if you don't make it in this video. You might have subscribed while it was encoding, so yeah. My bad.
I still love you.
Just kidding, but for real, you'll be in the next major video, don't worry. Are you jealous of everyone who has their name on screen? Well, maybe you could consider helping out Jill Valentine and taking out that subscribe button. I know she'd appreciate it, and she'll put your name up there for the next major video. And do I even gotta mention, you get to become a followy. What's a followy? Well, it's like a groupie following a rock star, except there's none of the divisive illegal stuff. I have a few other shout outs to give before I close out this video. I used an instrumental of Pig's Ear played by Owen Enfield. I'll link their work in the description. I trained the rapid zooming effect in the montage based off of this guy's amazing 9-string. I felt it would help a brother out. I'll link it in the description in case you're interested. I also wanted to announce that I've recently started a Discord server. It's something that my followees have actually asked me to do for an entire year. For an entire year, I've always said no and that I wasn't comfortable with it. And that's because, believe it or not, this Rain and Noodles YouTube channel is not the first time I've started something that just happened to blow up and find an audience. And every single time when it came to managing a community I would create on Discord, the experience was always stressful and very negative. Last time, it even made itself so time consuming that I couldn't dedicate any time to the project that the Discord server was for, which always sucks because I always found Discord to be really fun, especially when my own followees are gracious enough to invite me to their own servers. After a long time thinking about it, I decided that maybe if I just handled it differently, it would work out much better. So that, my ladies, gentlemen, and NBs, resulted in this, the Rain and Noodles Discord server. There are very few rules, there are very few moderators, and we have a very relaxed auto mod. My community has shown me time and time again that they do not need a babysitter, and I am very proud of that. Which is why on this Discord server, you can do and say almost literally anything. Almost. You can be as edgy and as cringy as you want, but all I ask in return is that you still be a decent human being. That's like literally the only real rule there is. And if everything goes to shit, I could just delete it and pretend it never happened, so there you go. But yeah, that will be linked in the description. My followees have always wanted a way to contact me outside of YouTube, so there you go. Speaking of contacting me, if you want to contact me on Twitter or I guess X. If you want to contact me on X, there's that down there as well. I can't promise I'll be too active on either of those mediums, but I mean, I'll try, guys. I'll try. And one final shout out for someone who's very special to me. I'm going to give a special shout out to somebody I'm going to refer to as H. I'm not going to share the real name here, but he's the other dude you heard during my gameplay footage. H is another massive fan of Resident Evil, but he happens to like the action games. So it was actually really useful to have him there to bounce my opinions on while I was revisiting these games. Most importantly, he's a longtime friend, and I've actually known him for many years. So naturally, during this call where I was playing these games, it made scrolling through the footage a lot of fun because his voice and my banter back and forth was included in it. So I wanted to give a massive shout out to H for actually indirectly helping me make this video. These calls were really long and he definitely had better shit to do, so I really appreciate him being there. Everyone, that means all the ladies, all the fellas, all the NBs. Thank you all so much for sitting through this entire video and my massive rant at the end. You all have a good one. Peace.